I never thought I'd end up here, sitting in my car outside our house at 10 p.m., wondering why Claire wasn't home yet. The rational part of me told me I was just being paranoid, that everything was fine. But the nagging feeling in the back of my mind refused to quiet down. Claire had been acting differently lately. Not dramatically so, just little things. She was distant, distracted, and the late nights at the office had become more frequent, even though she used to get home at a decent hour. She always had an excuse: long meetings, unexpected projects. But I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. I tried to convince myself I was being irrational. We had a good marriage, a strong one. She'd always been open with me about everything. But this felt like a shift. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off. Tonight was no different. She texted me around 7, saying she'd be finishing up a presentation for a big meeting. "I'll be home a little late. Don't wait up," she'd written, followed by a quick smiley face emoji, the kind she always sent when she didn't want to explain much. But that was hours ago. I checked my phone again. No updates. No calls. I sat there for a while, my eyes fixed on the front door of our house. The longer I waited, the more my mind started to race. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe she was just busy. But still, that gut feeling gnawed at me. I told myself I'd give it another half hour. But as the minutes ticked by, I knew I couldn't just sit here. I had to do something. I had been by the office a few times, but I'd never been the kind of husband who showed up uninvited or demanded explanations. Claire had always been a professional, and I had no reason to doubt her. But tonight, that trust felt fragile, like the slightest pressure might break it. I decided to go. Maybe she was just stuck at the office. Maybe it was nothing. But I had to know. The office was only 10 minutes away, but it felt like an eternity as I drove, each stoplight dragging me further from my calm. What was I hoping to find? What did I expect to see? I didn't know. I only knew that the nagging sense that something was wrong had grown so loud I couldn't ignore it anymore. As I pulled into the parking lot, the office building loomed in front of me like a dark silhouette. The lights inside were mostly off, but through the glass doors, I could see faint outlines of empty desks. The building was quiet, too quiet considering the time of night. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise empty parking lot. The building always felt cold at night, like it was waiting for something. The receptionist's desk was vacant, just as I expected. I stood in front of the elevator for a moment, unsure. Was I overstepping by even being here? It wasn't like Claire had lied about where she was. She hadn't promised to be home at any specific time. But something in me wouldn't let go of the feeling that I needed to see for myself. I pressed the button and waited for the elevator to arrive, my nerves tightening with every passing second. The doors slid open, and I stepped inside, my reflection in the polished metal walls feeling strangely alien, like I didn't belong here. The elevator ride felt interminably slow, each floor sliding past too quickly, each ding sounding louder than the last. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to shake the tension from my shoulders. But the pit in my stomach only grew deeper. What was I expecting to find? As the doors opened, the familiar hallway stretched out before me. It was dark, just dimly lit by the emergency lights above. I knew the layout by heart. Her office was at the end of the hall, but Caldwell's office, her boss's office, was just around the corner. I hadn't seen much of him outside of a few business meetings, but I had to admit that something about him made me uneasy. He was too polished, too smooth, always charming, always with a smile that felt a little too rehearsed. I walked past the rows of cubicles, each one empty, the silence in the air thick with abandonment. It wasn't like the office to be this quiet at this hour. Usually there were at least a few people working late. The sense that something wasn't right, that something had changed, only intensified. I reached the corner and stopped. There was a light spilling out from under the door of Caldwell's office. It wasn't bright, but it was unmistakable. Someone was in there. I froze, suddenly unsure of what to do. The office was usually locked at night, but this was different. The door was slightly ajar, and the light spilling out seemed warmer, almost inviting. My heart began to race, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and leave. I leaned closer, trying to make out the sounds coming from within. Faint voices. too low for me to make out words. I could hear a rustling sound, something soft, something deliberate. I felt a sharp breath catch in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. This could be nothing. Maybe Claire had stayed late for work. Maybe she was just finishing up something important with Caldwell or another colleague. But that small, irrational voice inside me, the one I had been trying to ignore, kept telling me there was more to this. I stepped back into the shadows, not wanting to be seen, but also unable to tear myself away. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something had shifted, something was happening right now. And I had no idea what it was, but I needed to know. The minutes stretched on, the tension coiling tighter in my chest. I wasn't sure how long I stood there. Was it seconds? Was it minutes? But something inside me told me I was at a breaking point, and whatever came next would change everything. I had to know. But what if I wasn't ready for the answer? I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. The seconds dragged on like hours as I stood in the shadows, my mind racing through 1,000 possible explanations. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Claire was just wrapping up a late meeting. Maybe Caldwell was giving her a final review before a big presentation. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I felt a sense of unease creeping over me, a cold rush of adrenaline that told me this was no ordinary late night. I took a hesitant step toward the door, then stopped. My pulse hammered in my ears. I could still hear voices inside, but now I could make out the faint sounds of movement, footsteps, the shuffle of papers. I couldn't quite hear what they were saying, but something about it felt wrong. I told myself I would just look. I'd glance in through the crack in the door. That was all. It wasn't like I was planning to confront them. Not yet, but I needed to know. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst. Slowly, I inched forward, pressing my ear to the cool glass. And then I heard her. Claire's voice, low and soft. It wasn't her usual voice. It was more intimate. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking the tone. It sent a shockwave of recognition straight to my gut, a sickening, horrible feeling. This wasn't a business conversation. This wasn't work. This was something else. I couldn't stop myself. I pushed the door open just a fraction, just enough to peer inside. The sight that greeted me felt like a punch to the stomach. Claire was standing there, her back to me, and the first thing I noticed was how different everything looked. The office was no longer the sterile, professional space I had walked through countless times. The lights were dim, soft. There were candles lit around the room, flickering in the quiet air. It was surreal, like something out of a dream or a nightmare. And there he was, Caldwell. I hadn't seen him this close up before, but there was no mistaking him now. He was standing close to Claire, too close. I saw his hand resting on her shoulder, his fingers brushing her skin as he leaned in to whisper something. Everything in my body screamed at me to run, to turn around and walk away, to leave the office and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding before me. For a moment, I stood there paralyzed, my breath catching in my throat. Was this really happening? Was Claire really standing there, so close to him, so comfortable? And then it hit me. Everything clicked into place. The late nights, the secrecy, the way Claire had been pulling away from me for weeks. This wasn't just a friendly work relationship. This wasn't a project. This was something far worse. I stepped back, a burst of anger flooding through me. I couldn't think. I couldn't reason. My body was acting on pure emotion now, rage, betrayal, confusion, all swirling into one. Without thinking, I pushed the door open wider, the movement sharp and sudden. The door creaked as it swung open fully, and Claire turned toward me, her eyes wide in shock. The moment our eyes met, I saw the truth in her face. She wasn't surprised to see me. She was caught. Caldwell, too, turned, his expression changing from calm to something else, something defensive, but it was too late. I was already past the point of no return. What the hell is this? I screamed, my voice raw with rage. Claire opened her mouth to say something, but I didn't care. My hands shook as I turned toward the room, toward the things that had once been symbols of success and respect in this office. But now they felt like an insult. The wall behind Caldwell's desk was lined with awards, certificates, plaques, The kind of things he proudly displayed to remind everyone of his success. The things I had always admired as markers of hard work and achievement. I reached for the first plaque, the one closest to me, and yanked it off the wall. The metal frame twisted in my hands, and I threw it to the floor. The sound of shattering glass was like music to my ears. I didn't care. I didn't care about anything anymore. How long? I shouted at Claire, my voice echoing in the quiet office. How long has this been going on? Caldwell took a step forward, his voice attempting to remain calm. You need to calm down? No, I roared, turning toward him now, my fists clenched. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest award from his desk, a heavy, polished statue, and hurled it across the room. It crashed into the wall, splintering into pieces. I turned back to the shelf, my hands trembling with fury, and tore the next certificate from its frame. It was like I couldn't stop. The rage was too much. The betrayal was too much. With a growl, I ripped the frame in half, the glass cutting into my palm, but I didn't care. I was beyond caring. Claire was crying now, calling my name, but I couldn't look at her. I couldn't hear her anymore. All I could see was the mess I was making, the wreckage of my own life, of everything I thought I knew. I grabbed another award, a glass trophy this time, and smashed it against the floor. It shattered into a million pieces, the sharp shards reflecting the dim light in chaotic patterns. Through it all, Caldwell was still standing there, frozen in disbelief. But Claire, she was trying to speak, trying to explain, trying to reach me. I could see the guilt, the shame, but it didn't matter. Nothing she said could ever take back what had happened. You think this is just a mistake? You think you can explain this away? My voice cracked as I yelled, each word more desperate than the last. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop until everything was broken. I kept tearing and smashing, destroying the things that had meant something once, things that didn't matter anymore. The office, the awards, all of it all felt like an insult now. And Claire, standing there, vulnerable and caught, only made the devastation worse. As I stood there in the wreckage of Caldwell's office, panting, my anger still boiling, the truth finally set in. She had betrayed me, and nothing could ever fix this. I turned and stormed out of the room, not even looking back. The only thing I could think about now was how to escape from the world I once knew, the world that had just come crashing down around. I barely remember the drive home. The road was a blur, the night air cold against my face as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. My mind was a storm, and every thought in it was sharp, razor-like. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. But where? Where could I go with this anger? With this betrayal? I didn't want to go home. Not yet, but I had nowhere else to go. The house was eerily quiet when I walked through the door. Claire had finally come home, or perhaps she had never left. It was hard to tell. All I knew was that everything felt wrong. The silence was suffocating. My eyes scanned the living room, the dining table, the pictures on the wall, the life we built together. And then my eyes settled on the couch, where Claire had once sat beside me, laughing at some inside joke we shared. It was supposed to be a home, a place of safety, but now it felt like a prison. I didn't wait for her to speak. I couldn't. I saw everything. I spat, my voice trembling with both fury and something deeper. Hurt, pain, betrayal. It all swirled together in a toxic mess that I couldn't untangle. I saw you with him, in his office. Claire didn't move. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, and for a moment, I almost saw the woman I used to know, the woman I loved. But that image was fleeting, like a ghost that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Now all I saw was a stranger standing before me. I'm sorry, she whispered. Her voice was small, almost fragile, like a woman broken by the weight of her own choices. I didn't mean for this to happen. It's not what you think. I laughed, but it wasn't a laugh. It was a bitter sound, a rasp of disbelief. Not what I think. I saw it, Claire. I saw everything. I stepped toward her, the anger rising up again like a tide that was impossible to control. I wasn't just angry with her. I was angry with myself. Angry that I hadn't seen the signs sooner. angry that I had allowed myself to trust, to believe. I had let her slip away, and now there was nothing left but the wreckage. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. There was no conviction in her words anymore. I don't know what happened. I couldn't hear it. I couldn't listen to her excuses. Without thinking, I reached for the nearest thing, a chair by the dining table, and with a single movement, I sent it crashing to the ground. The sound of the wood splintering echoed through the room, sharp and final. Claire flinched, and I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. But it wasn't enough to stop me. Nothing could stop me now. "You don't know what happened?" My voice was low, guttural. "You don't know? I saw you with him, Claire. I saw it with my own eyes. You didn't even try to hide it. You just let him touch you. Let him take you." I was pacing now, each step harder than the last, my body coiled tight with rage. I could feel the walls closing in on me. My vision was narrowing, and all I could focus on was her. The woman who had betrayed me in the most raw, humiliating way. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear your apology. You don't get to apologize for this." My breath was coming faster now, my chest heaving with each word. "You did this, and I can't just pretend it didn't happen." Claire reached for me, her hand outstretched, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "Don't touch me," I growled. The room seemed to close in on me. I could feel my emotions bursting at the seams. I was no longer just angry, I was broken. The woman I thought I knew was gone, and in her place was someone unrecognizable. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break everything in sight. I walked into the living room, my hands shaking, my mind a frenzy of chaotic thoughts. The house that had once felt like home now felt like a battlefield. Every inch of it screamed with the weight of her betrayal. Without thinking, I grabbed a picture frame off the mantel. One of our wedding day, where we stood smiling, hands clasped. We looked so happy, so in love. I threw it against the wall with everything I had. The glass shattered, scattering across the floor in a million jagged pieces. That was nothing compared to how I felt inside. I felt like everything I had ever known had been reduced to rubble. All the memories, all the moments we shared, every smile, every laugh, it was all a lie. It was all gone. I stormed through the house, ripping down photos from the walls, shoving chairs aside, throwing anything I could find to the floor. Nothing mattered anymore. Not the memories, not the years we'd spent together. They were all tainted now, worthless. Every frame I shattered, every object I tossed aside felt like a small victory, but it didn't make the pain go away. "You destroyed everything," I muttered, my voice hoarse. "Everything we had, Claire. You destroyed it." She didn't try to stop me. She just stood there, watching as I tore apart the house we had built together. It was like she didn't even exist in my world anymore. The anger was so overwhelming that it consumed me, and I couldn't stop myself. The world had turned upside down, and all I could do was rage against it. I finally stopped, standing in the middle of the wreckage, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was a mess, and so was I. My hands were trembling, my body aching with exhaustion. But there was still one thing I needed to do. I turned toward Claire, my eyes cold. "I don't know who you are anymore." She didn't say anything. She didn't try to explain. Maybe she knew it was too late. Maybe she knew there was nothing left to say. Without another word, I walked out the door, leaving her standing there, alone in the chaos. I had no idea where I was going. I just needed to get away from her, away from this life that had been shattered in an instant. It felt like I was walking in a dream, a nightmare I couldn't escape. And as I slammed the door behind me, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until this moment. The woman I loved was gone, and so was the man I used to be. I walked aimlessly through the streets, my mind an uncontrollable swirl of chaos. The cold air bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. It was like I had left my body behind somewhere, and now I was just a shell, carrying the weight of something that could never be undone. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. From her, from the house, from everything that reminded me of the life I thought I had. Everywhere I looked, there were flashes of memories. The restaurant where Claire and I had our first date. The park where we'd taken walks on lazy Sundays. Our living room, with its stupid throw pillows and framed pictures of us smiling like the world was perfect. I couldn't escape it. Everywhere I went, I saw the lie. I ended up at the bar around the corner from our house. It was one of those dimly lit places with worn leather stools and the kind of silence that only comes after midnight, when the world feels like it's holding its breath. The kind of place you go when you have no idea what to do with yourself. I ordered a drink without even thinking about it. The glass was cold in my hand, but it didn't matter. I could feel the burn in my throat, but it didn't stop the aching in my chest. Nothing did. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to feel this way. But I didn't know how to stop. So I drank. I drank to forget. As the alcohol slid down my throat, the blur of the last few hours began to dull, just a little. The sharpness of the anger faded into something else, something darker, something deeper. A hollow ache that I wasn't sure how to fill. But there was a part of me, a small part, that wished I hadn't come here. I couldn't escape the nagging thought that I was drowning in my own rage, that it was consuming me. But it was too late. The damage was done. I didn't know how long I'd been there when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I checked it without thinking, hoping for anything but another message from Claire. It was her. "We need to talk. Please. I know I messed up, but I never wanted to hurt you. Please come home." I stared at the words for what felt like an eternity. Each one seemed to burn into my mind. Each one a reminder of what had happened, what I had seen. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, wanted to scream at her, wanted to tell her that there was nothing to talk about, that everything was ruined, that nothing would ever be the same again. But instead, I sat there, staring at the screen. I should have been stronger. I should have walked away, cut ties, left her in the mess she had made. But a part of me, the part that was still clinging to the pieces of the man I used to be, wanted to hear her out, wanted to know why, even though I knew I would never truly get an answer that would make sense. I stood up, unsteady on my feet, and headed for the door. I didn't know what I was doing anymore, only that I had to go back. I had to confront it. I had to confront her. The drive back was a blur. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of dream, disconnected from everything. The streets were empty. The silence in my car was deafening. And for the first time, I realized how truly alone I felt. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. It felt like a hollow shell, empty and waiting. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't prepared for the sight of Claire standing at the door. She was waiting for me, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. Her body was stiff, like she was bracing herself for something. I stopped before I reached the door, the air between us thick with everything we hadn't said yet. The cold of the night, the tension in the space, it all seemed to close in on me. She took a step toward me, but I stayed rooted in place. "Please," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I know I've ruined everything, but I need you to hear me out. I never meant for any of this to happen. It's not what you think." I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tear into her, to make her feel the weight of what she'd done. But I was too tired, too hollow. "I don't know what to say to you, Claire," I said, my voice flat cold. I could barely recognize it. "I don't know who you are anymore. I don't know how to come back from this." She took another step closer, and I could see her trembling. It wasn't just the cold. It was fear. Fear of losing me. Fear of everything she'd built coming crashing down. But how could I come back from this? How could I come back from seeing her with him, in his office, the way she'd let him touch her, like there was no difference between me and him? "You don't have to forgive me," she said softly. "But please let me explain. Let me tell you why. I never wanted to hurt you. I swear." I stood there, silent, as the last remnants of my rage slowly drained away, leaving a hollow pit where my heart had once been. I didn't want her explanation. I didn't want to hear it. Nothing she said would ever make this okay. But then, there was a part of me that still wanted to hear it. A part of me that still needed to understand. What had gone so wrong? Where had we gone wrong? I walked past her, not saying a word, and entered the house. It felt like stepping into a foreign land, a place I didn't recognize. Everything was still in ruins. Broken glass, toppled chairs, the wreckage of everything I thought we had. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. "Not now. Not yet. I need to be alone," I muttered, walking into the living room, away from her. She didn't follow me. I don't think she could. She was too broken, too scared. And maybe, just maybe, I was too broken to face her right now. I sat down in the middle of the mess, the silence hanging between us like a shroud. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I didn't know if I was even waiting for anything at all. But one thing was clear. This wasn't a marriage anymore. It was a war. And I didn't know how we'd ever come out of it. I sat in the silence of the living room, the darkness pressing in on all sides, as Claire stood a few feet away, uncertain whether to approach or give me space. The house was a mess, my mess, and I couldn't escape the feeling that the life we'd built together was now scattered across the floor, shattered beyond repair. She hadn't said anything else. Maybe she was waiting for me to speak. Maybe she didn't know what else to say. Maybe she had finally realized that words wouldn't change what had happened, that there was no fixing it. I stared at the broken glass, the destroyed frames. The picture of us on our wedding day, cracked and torn. Our family photos, torn to pieces on the floor. A reflection of how I felt. A reflection of how far gone we were. I didn't want to look at her. I couldn't. I wanted to drown out the guilt, the anger, the pain that still felt so fresh. But the silence hung between us like a heavy fog. And then, in the midst of that silence, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, almost automatically, and saw a message from an unknown number. The name didn't ring any bells, and I hesitated before opening it. But something told me I had to look. The curiosity, the need for answers, it was too strong. I tapped the screen, and as the message opened, my heart nearly stopped. "Hey, it's Mark. I just wanted to let you know I'm sorry. Claire, and I thought you'd never find out, but I guess it was only a matter of time. It's over, but I wanted to tell you that it's not just work. I didn't mean for it to go this far, but she's been with me for a while now. I didn't know what else to say. I'm sorry, man. She's yours to deal with now." I froze. The words blurred in front of my eyes as I reread the message, the reality of what I was reading sinking in like cold water, chilling me to the bone. Mark, her colleague, the one who was supposed to be a friend at work, the one I had trusted, the one I had never considered as a threat. My breath came shallow and quick, and I felt my pulse thundering in my ears. She's been with me for a while now. The words echoed, ricocheting through my brain. It wasn't just one incident. It wasn't a mistake. This had been going on for months. I looked up at Claire, who was still standing in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. She couldn't even look at me. Her eyes were cast down, the weight of her guilt so heavy that I could almost feel it. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the realization that she wasn't sorry. Not truly. She wasn't sorry she'd hurt me. She was sorry she'd been caught. Sorry that everything had been exposed. Sorry that the life she'd built on lies was crumbling at her feet. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp and final. "You knew, didn't you?" My voice was barely a whisper, but the intensity in it rattled the air between us. Her eyes flickered up, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she nodded once, a small, defeated motion that sent a new wave of rage crashing through me. The weight of it hit me all at once. The betrayal wasn't just one person. It was both of them. The trust I'd given Claire, the trust I'd placed in my colleagues and my friend, it had all been shattered. And the worst part was how long it had been going on. How many times had I unknowingly looked the other way? How many nights had I waited for her to come home while she was with him? I took a step toward her, my body trembling with anger, and then another. But this time, it wasn't a scream I was holding back. It was something darker, something that felt far colder than the rage. "I loved you, Claire," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the hurt leaking through. "I trusted you, and this is how you repay me." The silence between us grew unbearable. She reached out then, her hand trembling as she tried to touch my arm. But I stepped back, pushing her hand away without even thinking. "Don't," I said. "You don't get to touch me anymore. Not after this." She stood there, her face pale, tears brimming in her eyes, but I didn't care. It didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew, was gone. And all that was left was this hollow version of her standing in front of me, her guilt weighing her down like an anchor. And then, for the first time, I realized that there was nothing left to say. No more explanations. No more apologies. I turned and walked out the door. This time I didn't look back.